December 20th, 1943. Early morning, over the North Sea. The 379th Bombardment Group, flying B-17 Flying Fortresses from RAF Kimballton, launched a raid on the Focke-Wulf and Junkers factories in Bremen. Among the aircraft that day was Ye Olde Pub, crewed by 2nd Lieutenant Charles "Charlie" Brown and his men. They were fully briefed. Flak defenses, Luftwaffe patrol zones, expected resistance. Their route sketched over maps in mission briefings. The bomber was loaded with bombs, full fuel tanks, and a crew of 10, ready to pay a grievous price if hit. As they crossed the target area, heavy flak from Bremen's flak batteries lit the sky with orange blossoms. The air thundered with bursts of 88mm shells exploding around bombers. One round slammed into Ye Olde Pub's starboard engine, setting it aflame. A second shell ruptured the fuselage, shredded the tail rudder, and severed hydraulic lines. The B-17 lurched, instruments flickered, oxygen lines sagged. Co-pilot and navigator were dazed, at least one man wounded, blood smudging the plexiglass windows. The radio operator's microphone crackled with static and fear. The aircraft lost altitude. Engines sputtered. Smoke trailed behind. Yet the bomber stayed aloft on 3 engines. Captain Brown wrestled the controls. He was trained to fly under damage. He had flown dozens of missions already. In his log, his hand shook, but his voice over the intercom stayed even. He ordered the rear gunner to scan for fighters. He tried the interphone. "Let's limp south," he said. Flames licked the trailing edge of the wing. The hydraulics for the tail rudder were dead. The B-17's controls responded with delay. Every micro-adjustment was a risk. The crew strapped in, ears filled with the roar of wind through holes, the ping of shrapnel, and the distant thunder of other bombers. As they fell back from the formation, Ye Olde Pub became vulnerable. Their escort fighters had pulled ahead. The radar escort had left the zone. Enemy night fighters might emerge. The bomber bucked, list to port, and the tail gunner warned of fragments dislodging. Under Brown's direction, the navigator ran charted waypoints to steer them toward friendly airspace. But Bremen was still far to the east. Fuel was burning fast. One by one, internal circuits failed. The waist gunners reported broken floor panels, loose panels in the bomb bay, and instruments dimming. The ghost of a broken propeller blade came flying past a window. Somewhere overhead, all was calm. The cloud deck offered partial concealment. Brown looked upward when he could. He saw nothing but gray underside, no enemy trace yet. A fracture in the sky, a distant contrail maybe. He made the decision. They would descend lower, risk flak, but trade the altitude advantage of fighters against the damage already done. He whispered a prayer, rare but real, for each man on board. As the bomber limped west, crew members patched holes with tape, braced torn bulkheads with webbing, monitored fuel pressure, and shared morphine where needed. Pilots logged altitude losses by the hundreds of feet. The voice of the navigator cracked when he announced they were passing over the Dutch coast, which should have been clear of German fighters if lines held. Brown replied, "Stay alert. We're not safe yet." The night was long, the engines strained, the sky a landscape of shadows and risk. In that battered, bleeding fuselage, the crew held position. They knew they might not survive. They pushed the throttle, praying for lift. They eased the bomber east-west, always aiming for the sea where, they hoped, rescue or safe return might exist. But above them, somewhere, a Luftwaffe pilot had scrambled to intercept. Franz Stigler had launched that morning like he had dozens of times before. Bf-109G6, 20mm cannon, and twin 13mm machine guns, the same cold air over Lower Saxony, the same calculus of closing speed and deflection. He was JG-27, a veteran of North Africa and Sicily, now back on the home defense line, and by noon on the 20th of December, 1943, the sky over Bremen was a furnace. 8th Air Force mission. 159, more than 500 heavies inbound, flak walking up through contrails, twin-engine Zerstörer, and single-seat fighters punching into the box formations. 13 American bombers would not come home. 122 more were holed and limping. The statistics were brutal, but they were normal for Bremen. What wasn't normal was the shape that drifted past Oldenburg Airfield as Stigler stood on the line refueling, a B-17 flying by itself at barely 1,000 feet, nose glass blown away, one prop windmilling, another barely turning, empennage shredded. He had already claimed 2 bombers earlier, and his radiator had taken a .50 caliber hit. But this one looked like a ghost continuing on momentum. He strapped in, lifted, and climbed after it. Up close, he could see the anatomy of the damage. Flak had wrecked the plexiglass nose and knocked out the number. 2 engine. The number. 4 had to be throttled back. Later, fighter passes had chewed into the number. 3. Only the left inboard engine was giving full power. Half the rudder and most of the left horizontal stabilizer were gone. Control runs and oxygen lines were torn. The tail gunner's position hung open like a ripped hinge. The pilot, Charles Charlie Brown, 379th Bomb Group, on his crew's first mission, had been hit in the shoulder. Several others were wounded. The tail gunner, Hugh Eckenrode, was dead. The fortress had fallen from 27,000 feet to treetop height after an unconscious spin and somehow leveled. Any ordinary intercept would have been brief. Slide to 6 o'clock low, 1 burst, and let gravity finish the rest. Stigler eased up on the port side instead. Through the torn metal, he could see faces, blood bright against aluminum, eyes wide but unfocused, men working guns that no longer tracked. In the nose, there was no gun at all, only a jagged hole and wind. Training and 1,000 briefings pressed in. The job is to destroy enemy bombers before they reach the target, and to finish cripples so they cannot return tomorrow. Another pressure pressed back, older than briefings. In JG-27, the lesson had been explicit. You do not fire on a man descending in a parachute. There is a line. You remain a pilot, not an executioner. What he was looking at felt close enough to a shoot. Post-war accounts attribute that code to his Africa commander, Gustav Rödel. Stigler would say later he recognized helpless men. He slid forward to the B-17's nose and tried to signal. His gloved hand pointed down toward open fields. Land here. He rocked his wings and then pointed northeast. Sweden. Neutral. 15 minutes across the Baltic if they could climb a little. Inside Ye Olde Pub, Brown and his co-pilot, Spencer Luke, stared back through a hurricane of slipstream and could not decode anything that wasn't survival. Brown's plan, if plan was the word, was simpler. Hold heading 300, find the North Sea, and pray an engine didn't seize before the coast. So Stigler made a different decision. He moved to the B-17's starboard quarter and stayed there, just off the wingtip, close enough that German flak batteries would hold fire rather than risk hitting a friendly fighter, close enough that any other interceptor would have to think twice before firing through him to reach the American. It was a strange formation, a ruined fortress and a Messerschmitt flying companionable at stall margin, hedgerows sliding under the wings, both aircraft wobbling in the low-level turbulence of a cold December afternoon. They reached the Weser, then the brown winter fields west of Bremen, then the edge of the North Sea. Stigler kept station until the water turned slate and there was nothing ahead of the bomber but open distance and the understanding that any further would be treason. He pulled forward to the nose one last time, lifted his hand in salute. Palm open, brief, formal, then banked east and disappeared. Brown pointed the broken airplane toward England. What Stigler saw inside the B-17 has been corroborated in multiple post-war tellings because so much of it was documented that day already. The mission logs from the 379th Bomb Group at Kimbolton show Ye Olde Pub, separated and mauled. Casualty tallies list Eckenrode KIA and several crew WIA. 8th Bomber Command's strike summary records Bremen's flak effectiveness and the heavy fighter opposition. And Luftwaffe records confirm JG-27's Bf-109 patrols out of Oldenburg that intercepted stragglers at low altitude as the bomber stream turned for home. Even the descent to approximately 1,000 feet shows up in the synthesis. Brown later told debriefers he blacked out, recovered near the deck, and dragged the fortress west on one good engine. The ending that day was improbable but precise. Over the sea, the Messerschmitt peeled away. Ye Olde Pub limped the last approximately 250 miles across winter water and put down not at Kimbolton, but at RAF Seething in Norfolk, an emergency landing at a nearby station of the 448th Bomb Group, the closest bit of runway that could accept a fortress that might not go around. Back in the debrief room, Brown reported the escorting German fighter. He was told, firmly, to keep it to himself. The fear wasn't fairy tale optics, it was operational. Don't file a story that suggests German fighters can fly formation with our bombers without being engaged. Don't hint at routes, altitudes, or the condition of a damaged ship that still made it home. On the other side of the line, Stigler also said nothing. To admit he had spared an enemy, escorted him through German flak, and waved him off over the sea was to risk court-martial. Both men did their jobs, and then edited the one unmilitary thing they had done out of the official day. The moral hinge here requires no embroidery, because the facts are exact enough to carry it. Stigler had every material incentive to finish the attack. A third bomber that day would have advanced his tally. The cripple could not fight back. His own machine was already holed and running hot. Instead, he applied a different rule set, one that survived across units and fronts in small pockets, long after total war burned most alternatives away. Escorting the enemy to the coast was not mercy in the abstract. It was a series of practical actions: wingtip shielding against flak, hand signals toward neutral airspace, pacekeeping with a wounded aircraft at the ragged edge of stall. Brown's actions, too, were practical. Hold trim against a torn tail, nurse one engine, keep the horizon flat, and trust that a silhouette pacing your wing isn't the last thing you'll ever see. Everything else, how they stayed quiet, how they found one another in 1990, how the story finally reached public memory, belongs to later sections. What matters in the air over Bremen is secure. Date, units, aircraft, damage, headings, and the escort itself. On the 20th of December, 1943, a Luftwaffe ace came. A dying bomber, read the inside of it like a cockpit checklist, and decided not to add one more wreck to the statistics of Bremen. He raised his hand. He turned away, and a crew that should have died over the Weser watched Germany slide behind them and the gray shape of England rise out of the winter sea. The B-17 limped into RAF Seething on the 20th of December, 1943. Debriefers listened to Charlie Brown's account of the German fighter that formed up on his wing and then let him go, then stamped the report secret. Brown was told not to speak of it. The rationale was practical and political. If the Luftwaffe pilot were identified, he could be prosecuted by his own side, and there was no appetite in wartime for public stories that humanized the enemy. Brown complied. The mission went into his logbook. The incident went no further. Within the formal paperwork, the flight existed only as damage tallies and crew status. 1 tail gunner dead, multiple wounded, aircraft counted Cat B, and later struck from combat. When Brown finished his tour, he rotated home, rejoined the new U.S. Air Force in 1949, and spent the early Cold War in intelligence work, another career where silence and classification were routine. He eventually left government service in the 1970s. The December 1943 encounter remained a story he told only in private circles, if at all. On the other side of the lines, Franz Stigler filed no claim. There was nothing in the victory lists of JG-27 for a crippled fortress that day because he hadn't fired. In the Luftwaffe, failing to destroy a vulnerable enemy could bring court-martial, or worse, as post-war accounts put it, especially by late 1943, when Germany's fortunes had turned and discipline had hardened. Stigler kept his decision to himself. He later said he told no superior and almost no one else. He simply flew the next scramble. Both men absorbed the incident into the larger pattern of survival. Brown's unit, the 379th Bomb Group, continued maximum effort missions through winter 1943–44. Bremen and the northern German targets remained among the most heavily defended in the 8th Air Force target system. Brown's damaged airplane, B-17 F-42-3167, Ye Olde Pub, was ferried out of combat service in 1944 and scrapped after the war. The crew carried on with replacement aircraft, their citations and decorations reflecting the record of the group rather than the singular anomaly over Bremen. Stigler's war moved in the opposite direction, from piston to jet. He later flew the Me-262 with Jagdverband 44 in the final months, one of the small cadre of pilots transferred into Hitler's last technology gamble. It did not change the strategic outcome, and it did not change what he had done over Bremen. He had seen wounded airmen inside an open, shot-through fuselage and chosen not to kill them. In a system that measured worth in Abschüsse, kills, there was no place to record restraint. The safest entry was none at all. After 1945, Stigler rebuilt a life far from Bavaria's airfields. He emigrated to Canada in 1953, part of a wider post-war migration of skilled aviators and mechanics to North America. He worked in civil aviation and business and stayed out of the historical record except for a line or two in rosters of former JG-27 pilots. No memoirs, no interviews, no speeches, because the one story that would have defined him could have been misread as disloyalty by those who still framed the war in totals and tables. wvencyclopedia.org. Brown, for his part, learned how quickly memory can be dismissed by bureaucracy. His debrief had been classified in 1943. The language of the post-mission paperwork made no space for an enemy flying escort. When he spoke about the mission years later at veterans gatherings, it sounded to some like folklore, until he produced names, dates, the group diary, and the damage reports. Even then, there was no way to reach across oceans and decades to the man in the Messerschmitt. Not yet. What endured was not a legend, but an absence. No kill claim in German files, no combat credit line in American ones, and two men who did not talk publicly. In the official histories of the air war that appeared in the 1950s and 1960s, the episode is invisible, not because it did not happen, but because neither protagonist had reason, permission, or opportunity to make it part of the record. For nearly half a century, the encounter over Bremen existed only where most wartime decisions live after the fact, in memory, and in the quiet choices people make about what to say and what to keep. By the late 1980s, Charles Brown still carried one question no mission log could answer. Who was the German pilot who had spared him over Bremen? He had told the story quietly for years at veterans' gatherings, but each time he reached the same blank space, a salute through broken glass, then nothing. In 1986, speaking at Air University's Gathering of Eagles, Brown finally said aloud that he wanted to find him. He began the search like another mission: letters to the Air Force Historical Research Agency, queries to German veterans groups, appeals in Luftwaffe newsletters. He knew only the date, 20th December 1943, the target, Bremen, and that the fighter had been a Bf-109 with a yellow nose. The trail wound through archives and associations until, in early 1990, a reply arrived at Brown's home in Miami. The letter was postmarked Vancouver, Canada, and signed Franz Stigler. He wrote that he had been with Jagdgeschwader 27, flying from a field near Bremen that morning, that he had approached a mortally damaged B-17 whose tail gunner was dead and fuselage torn open, that he had seen wounded men trying to help one another inside. He remembered easing alongside the bomber, locking eyes with the pilot, and giving a salute before peeling away. Every detail matched Brown's memory. After 46 years, the two men finally had each other's names. They spoke first by telephone, trading memories like coordinates. Stigler recalled checking his guns, closing to within yards of the bomber's tail, then seeing faces, not targets. He had thought of his old commander, Gustav Rodel, who once told him, "If I ever hear of you shooting at a man in a parachute, I'll shoot you myself." That moment's echo had stayed with him. He told Brown he had escorted the B-17 until it crossed the coast, saluted, and turned home, knowing he might be court-martialed if anyone learned. Brown listened in silence. The two agreed to meet. On 21st June 1990, in Washington State, they met for the first time since that winter sky over Bremen. No ceremony, just a handshake that lasted longer than words could. Witnesses later said both men simply stared, as if verifying reality against memory. Stigler said, "I love you, Charlie." Brown replied, "I love you too, Franz." From that day forward, they were inseparable. They visited one another's families, spoke at schools and reunions, and began writing letters that filled a small archive. Two former enemies reconstructing a single event from opposite ends of history. The facts, once anecdotal, now lined up cleanly. Records from the 379th Bomb Group confirmed Brown's B-1742-3167 Ye Olde Pub had returned heavily damaged to RAF seething on the 20th of December 1943. Mission to Bremen. Heavy losses. Crew wounded. Luftwaffe logs showed JG-27 had scrambled single-plane intercepts that morning in the same sector. No claim was filed by Stigler. None of his superiors ever knew why. For decades, those two absences, a missing kill credit and an unexplained survival, sat on opposite sides of the war's paperwork until the reunion joined them. After 1990, Brown and Stigler began appearing together at aviation events, telling the story not as myth, but as documentation. They insisted it was not about heroism, only humanity. Brown often said, "Franz saved the crew of Ye Olde Pub, and for me, he saved the faith that even in war, there can be honor." Stigler would nod quietly and add, "You can't call it bravery. You can only call it right." Audiences of both Allied and German veterans stood for them. In 2008, historian Adam Makos compiled their letters, interviews, and mission records into A Higher Call, the definitive archival account confirming every traceable detail. Their friendship lasted the rest of their lives. Franz Stigler died on the 22nd of March 2008 in Vancouver. Charles Brown followed on the 24th of November 2008 in Miami. They were buried continents apart, but share the same inscription in several museum exhibits: enemy pilots who became brothers. Historians now cite their story as one of the best documented acts of chivalry of the air war, precisely because both men kept the records clean and the meaning simple. One chose not to fire, the other chose never to forget. Across half a century, those two decisions met again. Proof that a single act of mercy can outlive the war that created it.